I learned so much from these individuals just about the institution and about, what do you do when you have an issue? Who do you go to? Who do you go to first and who do you go to next? And I worked so hard on that paper for many years, and I got rejected, in all sorts of journals. And I should have asked for advice sooner. I kind of worked on it by myself for too long. As a young scholar, it is quite difficult to feel that you are being appreciated in the field. And first of all, it's important to recognize that this is a phase and to not give up, to just keep at it and to collaborate and learn and widen the network in order to not feel alone in that stage.
Welcome to Temple's One Questions Real Life in Academia, a talk show where we ask some of the scholars we admire the most about their careers, the best pieces of advice they have received, tips and tricks that explain their success, and also their struggles. My name is Vigan Shordash, and together with Volker Stocker, we are hosting this show. Today's guest is Professor Pinar Özcan. Pinar is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Business School at Oxford University. She's also the academic director of the Oxford Future Finance and Technology Initiative at Oxford. She specializes in strategy, entrepreneurship, and technology markets. And her current research includes AI and business models in fintech, open banking, and digital disruption in banking. She also studies the rise of big tech platforms. Pinar completed her PhD at Stanford Technology Adventures program at Stanford University, and she also holds a Master of Science and dual bachelor's degrees from the same university. She has been awarded several research and teaching awards, and in 2019 she was chosen as a British Academy Mid-Career Fellow for her work on disruption of banking in Europe and the UK. Welcome, Pinar, to our show. Thank you so much for your time. Would like to start with the first question. You have studied in the United States and you have worked for the past few years in the United Kingdom, first at Warwick and now at Oxford Said Business School. Could you briefly tell us more about your career path and perhaps reflect on what were the most important moments of your career?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. If I look back at my career, I have to say a lot of it started in my childhood when my father started an executive education company. I was at that point in time 6 years old, and because they didn't have a babysitter, they would take me to the company in order to help out making copies and licking envelopes and also to manual labor. But I was also kind of in the background listening to him, and then later on my mother also became certified as an educator. So as they were running these classes on leadership and strategy, I was in the background listening, and that really inspired me to really follow that path. But back then, even my father was always telling me, if you really want to do this, you need to become a professor. If you're a professor, that's really when people respect you. So I actually didn't even know what it was like to be a professor, but I knew that was something that I needed to do to make a say, to have a say in this world. Then later on, when I was finishing high school, I realized that I did want to study management and applied for scholarships around the world. And I ended up being lucky enough to get a full scholarship from Stanford University to study for my undergraduate there. In my last year of undergraduate, I met Kathy Eisenhart, and she taking her class was really a kind of defining moment for me, because I realized among everything that I had studied at Stanford, strategy, especially tech firm strategy, was what I wanted to go into. So I applied for a PhD. I convinced her to work with me, and then 5 years later, I graduated, and I basically joined the world as an assistant professor over in Europe. And from then on, I've been doing research on tech strategy in different ways, like mobile, and now more and more fintech and AI. And it's just such a joy. And also to keep in touch with Stanford and to do joint projects with other graduates of that program.
That's actually very interesting because you basically had your parents as your role models in a way, and then at Stanford, I think it probably, I mean, at least for me as a woman, I think it really matters having like a female role model to inspire us. At least for me, it certainly does. And I think it's always very inspiring to hear that from other colleagues, I would say. So do you think that mattered? I mean, it's not a question on the list we would ask, but do you think that mattered for your development as a scholar?
Absolutely. I think having a role model is very important, and having a female role model, especially in academia. And believe it or not, when I was graduating kind of 15 years ago, there were even fewer women in academia and in our field especially. And it was very important to have a strong female role model to basically know that, yes, it may be difficult. Yes, colleagues may reject your work, but you can make it in this world, and you just have to keep at it. So it definitely added to my perseverance. And also hearing personal stories from Kathy about how hard she fought in order to get herself a place at Stanford.
What were the most significant challenges that you had to face, especially to get where you are right now?
Mm-hmm. I would say different phases of my career had different challenges, but to name a few that were quite significant, the PhD time was particularly challenging, and this was a time that I was away from home, half a world away to be exact, and being on financial aid, I wasn't able to visit frequently. So the emotional support was actually an issue during the PhD, because there are just so many setbacks and so many, you need to, until you get it right, you get it wrong many times. And during that time, it's actually not easy to be by yourself trying to make it. And so, Silicon Valley also has a quite cutthroat culture. It's not a very nurturing environment in a sense, right? So, so it was definitely not easy to get that PhD. And then I would say being an assistant professor was also not easy. And maybe what made it a bit more complicated for me was that I was in a relatively male-dominated society in my first job, which was Spain. And in addition, I was in a program, I was teaching in a program where the MBA was really highly ranked, which put a lot of pressure on me as an instructor. And I remember still when I first started my MBA class, my first MBA class ever, I looked at the list of students, and I realized, because they give all sorts of statistics about them, I realized that my age was actually lower than their average age. And that was not easy to handle, and so to earn their respect and to impress them with my knowledge. And so I would say that being an assistant professor and focusing on research while trying to do well in a really kind of high caliber MBA classroom was definitely very challenging. I learned a lot from it. I feel now that I can handle any classroom after that experience, but it definitely gave me some sleepless nights.
So the question then is, and this is the third question, how did you master these challenges? And what were your most important learnings from this experience that you faced?
Sure. So I have to say some of them I just had to go through them and just endure. And I cannot necessarily say, oh, there was a perfect solution and I found it and I applied it and everything was suddenly fine. During the PhD, I have to say that once I found the topic that excited me, everything started to look smoother, because I was now engaged and I was kind of going on field interviews and finding out about these companies and going to industry conferences, and field research is really so much fun. And so that, in a sense, took away a little bit of my kind of feeling of loneliness and lack of support, because suddenly I felt like I was in a different world. Not that that world was supporting me in any way, but at least it was new, and I was just learning so much, and it was a lot of fun. So that really, in a sense, once you start to kind of identify what excites you within that research world, I think things start to go quite a bit better. But I have to also say that before you get there, there's this what I call the dark year, or depending on the PhD program, maybe 6 months or 2 years, where you have defended so you have passed your qualification exams, and then you are now kind of getting ready to either collect data or to define your thesis topic better. So that dark year is actually particularly dark, because you're by yourself in your office kind of trying to figure this thing out, and you're not really collecting data yet, so you're not having fun. And I remember that to be a particularly lonely period. But let's see. So moving on to my first job as an assistant professor, I would say that one thing that I should have done, which I didn't, was to be more open about the challenges that I was facing. Mm-hmm. And in particular, at some point, I think that I was actually too much in the front stage. I was teaching too many of these really high caliber classes, and that stress was really getting to me. And I was a bit too proud to really share that with my department, and the fact that it was getting to me and affecting my health. And I tried to resolve the problem by myself. And if I had any advice to junior faculty members, I would say that don't be afraid to say, this is becoming too much. Can I teach half of this class? Can I co-teach a class? So for example, co-teaching is super important, because that gives you a chance to learn from someone who's a bit more senior, and also takes the pressure to half. Yeah. And so even if you don't get as good evaluations as that other person, which is probably going to be the case, it's okay, because you're learning and you're actually kind of also being evaluated as a package. And so those are some of the things that I would have suggested if I had the wisdom that I have today.
I personally feel that it's quite difficult to open up about challenges to your direct colleagues. Do you think it is good to have like a mentor, someone outside your department, someone more experienced, or not necessarily older, but someone from a different department, that you can talk to? Do you think that's a good way of also approaching it?
I think it absolutely is, and it's not easy to especially if some of your issues have to do with kind of teaching in that direct program. It's difficult to go to people who are also involved with it. So having people, even like I remember at some point, I ended up just having different mentors in that institution. I learned so much from these individuals just about the institution, and about what do you do when you have an issue? Who do you go to? Who do you go to first, and who do you go to next? Those kinds of things. You understand the internal politics of the organization, which every organization has.
Could you perhaps tell us or explain us how your interest in the sharing economy ties in with your other strands of scholarship?
Of course. So I started out being someone who was interested in the strategy of tech firms. And my earlier career was on mobile technologies, mobile content, gaming, ringtones, etc., because that's what was coming out. And in industry conferences, this was kind of the big topic. And then mobile payments became the next thing. So that's kind of how, in a sense, what I feel, and this is probably true in phenomenon-based research, when I'm studying something else related to that actually starts to catch my eye. And then I end up slowly shifting. Once that project is complete, I start to shift my attention to the next one. And the sharing economy really came about, let me try to remember. So this was in 2014, 2015, and I was looking at different kinds of firms to study in the UK. I had only been in the UK for 2 years, 3 years at that point in time, and I actually had an invitation to work with the Sharing Economy Trade Association of the UK. And so that's how my interest got started, because I went to their monthly meetings, and then they were so honest about everything that was going on, how they were struggling in some way, even issues like, do we invite Uber into the trade association or do we not, because they have a terrible public image? all sorts of very interesting issues like that were being discussed openly, and that allowed me. So in a sense, I didn't really look at them as platforms per se, but as ventures. And trying to understand what it is, what's special about these ventures, especially if you're a peer-to-peer platform, then there you have a certain set of unique challenges that you need to resolve. And that really motivated me to look into kind of the business models of these sharing firms, what kind of things they struggle with, what does it mean to be in the same category as Uber or versus or Airbnb versus in a different category. So it inspired a set of different studies from that kind of initial involvement.
Quantitative research always seems to be more valued. So I'll be very interested in knowing your opinion about what is the value of qualitative research nowadays? I mean, how would you explain it to someone who is debating on whether he or she should become more proficient on quantitative methods? Because this is something that I think there is quite a lot of pressure on young scholars to move away from qualitative research, and I think it's a pity, to be honest.
So I would say that quantitative research is not necessarily better valued, but better understood. There's, I think, especially quantitative researchers find it difficult to understand and evaluate qualitative research, even after so many years. When my papers are being reviewed, sometimes you get a reviewer asking, "What's your hypothesis?" Which just goes to show that there's just a lot of education that needs to be done, and there used to be a certain stigma around qualitative research as well. It's for people who can't do quantitative research kind of thing, but now we see much less of that because our numbers are increasing, and these papers are getting accepted at top journals, and so I think that that problem is probably becoming kind of less important. I would say qualitative research compared to quantitative research has a very different purpose. Its purpose, and that's why all my studies have been inductive qualitative research. Qualitative research can really show you, highlight what's going on in the real world, especially processes that we don't understand really well. These are things that you cannot get from a data set. And it's important to also have qualitative research, because if we don't understand mechanisms that lead to certain results, then in a sense we don't have a base for quantitative explorations later. And so qualitative research is extremely important for understanding the real world. It's also not easy to do, so it's very good to learn it during the PhD, because switching later to qualitative is actually quite difficult. But I would also say the opposite. If you're getting trained and if you're doing qualitative research for your PhD, it's very important to also understand and to also play a little bit with quantitative methods, because even if you never do quantitative research later as your primary methodology, you will need to review papers. And in order to do a good job on that, which is part of our profession, it's very important to also have an understanding of quantitative methods.
And what would you say are the most important aspects and to take into account when selecting a research methodology for, say, a new project?
I think it's important to think pretty broad, in the sense that different parts of the project may need different methodologies. So just to give you an example, I'm now looking into how financial wellness of citizens in different societies can be improved through technology, because there's a lot of new tech ventures that are looking into improving financial literacy or debt management or overall personal finance management kind of tools. And one of the things that I realized when I started to look at this is that it's not enough to look at this from the entrepreneur's perspective, because they have a certain understanding, a certain perception of what the biggest problem is, but that may actually not be the biggest problem in that society in terms of financial wellness. So I realized that I need to also have a consumer survey that basically looks at kind of what are some of the finance related challenges you're facing, and what do you wish were different in the way that you managed your finances, etc. And so I combined a consumer survey with field interviews with ventures, as well as other stakeholders such as regulators and big companies that might consider kind of giving money to projects like this. And it could also be that you start with a qualitative method and then you test some of the findings that you have with a quantitative method afterwards. We also now have machine learning as a quantitative tool, right, which I think very highly of. And so overall, I think that it's important to compartmentalize and try to attack the research question in different ways with different methods to build one holistic picture.
That's interesting. So multi-method approaches as well. Would you then, if I may have this follow-up question before moving to the next, how do you design your teams? Say, do you work regularly with, say, multidisciplinary teams? Do you prefer that? Because naturally, perhaps you can combine, right, say, complementary skill sets and methods.
Yeah, so I think that what I prefer is to work with people who are comfortable with qualitative and quantitative methods. I have to also say, quite honestly, that working with people from a different discipline is not easy, because especially when you come to this stage of writing something together, it's very difficult to write it to a target journal.
When you look at your career, from your perspective, how would you say has your, say, scholarship evolved in the last years in terms of interests, but also how you approach research questions?
I think the way that I approach research questions very much has to do with what I see in the field. So that hasn't changed really. What probably changed is that I have a better understanding of why this research topic is interesting. And that is because I understand the literature much better, and across different papers, because you end up touching upon different pieces of literature, you end up just having a much better understanding of why what you see in the field is valuable and novel. And so I think that that's pretty much has been my formula to let the field research basically, in a sense, help me decide what my next project will be.
So speaking of like publications and successes, there might be also some regrets perhaps. So do you have any academic regrets? So is there, for example, a book or article you didn't end up writing, or an article that was rejected and you didn't resubmit?
At this point, I'm lucky to say I don't have such an article, but if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would say yes. Okay. And the reason for that is that coming out of the PhD, my first paper was with my supervisor, Kathy Eisenhardt, but then the norm was that the second paper out of the PhD would be solo authored. Mm-hmm. And I worked so hard on that paper for many years, and I got rejected, in all sorts of journals. And I should have asked for advice sooner. I kind of worked on it by myself for too long. And I ended up getting some very valuable advice after I kind of asked around a little bit about what I'm doing wrong in that paper. Mm-hmm. And I was able to fix it. And that ended up being my solo author paper in SMJ. But from the time that data set was ready, it took me 10 years to publish that. And that's a lot of wasted time. I could have cut that time in half if I were more proactive in terms of using my network to get advice.
When you compare the challenges of starting an academic career now to when you finished your PhD, do you think, say, that young scholars face more challenges now? And if so, why?
So I would maybe compare this to an industry that is basically increasing in its maturity. And as you know, in earlier stage, I wouldn't say that 20 years ago our industry was early stage, but earlier stage than now for sure. Yeah. And I would say there was more uncertainty and less competition back then, whereas now there is less uncertainty and more competition. And that kind of evolution actually has important implications for young scholars. That means that when they're finding jobs, there's better understanding of what they're trying to do, but it's also, there's a lot more competition. And at the same time, it's potentially, on the one hand, it's easier to publish, for example, qualitative research because people have a much better understanding for it. But there is, in general, qualitative and quantitative, many more papers that are being published that are being sent to journals. And so I think that the field is bigger. There's more people competing in it, which is a good thing. You know, whenever people compete, the quality goes up. But it's just important to understand that that we are in a much more competitive world. Collaboration among scholars becomes more important, because it would be quite difficult especially for a qualitative researcher who needs to, on average, spend more time in the field, etc., and then writing the paper. It will be quite difficult for a purely qualitative researcher to publish 5-6 papers in a row in that period of kind of tenure clock, right, if they did it by themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important to start collaborating on different projects already from the PhD time, but especially also afterwards.
If you could give 3 pieces of advice to young scholars starting their career right now in your field, what would that be? This could have been number 1 if you want, like the collaborations.
Well, let me just think of, in general, what I would say, and then if it makes 3, great. If it doesn't make 3, we can repeat one of the earlier ones. Maybe the first thing that I would say is that it's quite normal at some point to feel like you're not going to succeed in this job. And that is just a phase that we go through. And that is a phase. And it's also, I have to say, our profession is a little bit unfair in that when we are a young scholar, we are actually treated quite differently compared to when we become more senior. For example, senior scholars have many more chances to publish because they get invited to publish things. As a young scholar, it is quite difficult to feel that you are being appreciated in the field. And first of all, it's important to recognize that this is a phase and to not give up, to just keep at it and to collaborate and learn and widen the network in order to not feel alone in that stage. I went through it, and I really suffered in that time, and I almost gave up. And I would want people to understand that this is normal. It's part of growing up, and to not give up. It's important to stand up against unfair situations, even as a young scholar. And I think all of us face unfair situations, and perhaps still females face more than male scholars. And potentially qualitative researchers face more challenges compared to quantitative researchers. And it's important. And, I have had my fair share of people degrading my research and kind of voting against or giving me promotions, and because they didn't understand what I did. And it's okay for them to not understand, but we have to protect ourselves, and we need to really feel strong against this kind of behavior, which has to do a lot with self-confidence, actually. So it's not so much about whether we have the right to say that, but whether we feel comfortable and strong enough to say that. And you will only feel strong enough if you believe in what you do. And sometimes that's not easy, because if you look at your publications as a young scholar, these publications may not tell you that you are good, right? Because it hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
But what happened to me, for example, was that for many years, I had only one publication, and that publication was with my supervisor. So if you look on paper, it looks like I can't do anything by myself. However, then suddenly I ended up having 4 more top publications in a very short time. And so publications may come in bulk sometimes. And it's important to not lose hope in the time before that, because that is a time that you need to go through in order to get yourself to that stage.
there is the show is called not 10 questions, Real Life in Academia, but 10 plus 1. And so there is the +1 question, which I would love to ask you now.
We briefed you a bit. So we asked you to think about a question you have always wanted to ask someone, or perhaps your academic role model, or you have always wanted to answer yourself. What would be your +1 question?
I always wonder, depending on where you come from and what culture you grew up in, how do you function in a foreign society? And how do you, if you have intentions to stay there, which all of us do, hopefully, then what is it that you do in order to feel that you belong there? And sometimes the answer can be, oh, I become part of an expat community, and that community ends up being kind of my home. I did that, in some ways in different places that I lived. But one of the disadvantages of that strategy for me was that if you're part of an expat community, a lot of people leave, and that community actually has a lot of turnover. So you end up losing a lot of your good friends in a very short time. Versus you could try to go local. You could try to invite your neighbors and try to kind of fit into your like street charity event and kind of that kind of stuff. But then that's sometimes that can be quite a bit harder, because in a sense you're different from the average person. And so there can be difficulty in kind of making yourself accepted and invited to these things, and also to feel comfortable, because there's also going to be some faux pas in terms of things that you should do and things you should not do,
So thank you very much, Pinar. We enjoyed it a lot. It was super, super interesting. And I really appreciate that you were that open and gave us these deep insights. And I think it was super, super insightful and beneficial for young scholars. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it was a lot of fun to speak with you.
Well, thank you so much, Pinar, for your time. It was a pleasure having you on our show.